These are the most important people you've never heard of. And not just for solving customer problems. Sure, they solve customer problems. They address the needs of executives. They address the needs of their colleagues. They're helping people keep employed. They're addressing shareholder needs. I mean, they're really simultaneously solving, if you will, the whole equation in a potentially hostile, it may not be hostile, it may be just an indifferent environment. And yet they have the will and the drive and the skill that they develop or have to pursue it.
Before we start into our brand new series on the work of Bruce Vojak, I want to thank our sponsor, Kyndryl, who runs and reimagines the technology systems that drive advantage for the world's leading businesses. With a unique blend of AI-powered consulting built on unmatched managed service capability, Kyndryl helps leaders harness the power of technology for smarter decisions, faster innovation, and a lasting competitive edge. Also check out the Kyndryl Institute, where there's a plethora of brilliant authors and thinkers from all over the world on a wide range of content and ideas. You can find that at www.kyndryl.com/institute. Based on years of interviews with over 50 serial innovators inside large, mature corporations, today's book asks, who are the rare individuals who repeatedly create breakthrough products from within big organizations? And how do they actually do it? Our guest and his co-authors find that serial innovators are not just creative thinkers, they are whole system operators who find important problems, invent solutions, navigate corporate politics, and shepherd ideas to market, all without a formal mandate to do so. The book is equally addressed to the innovators themselves, their managers, HR departments, and senior executives. The purpose of the book is to help people and corporations better understand, emulate, enable, support, and manage these unique and important individuals who have the potential to create new breakthrough products that result in large revenue and profit streams, primarily from large, mature firms. In the first of our series on his books, and to be honest with you, just off air, we agreed we're going to do even more. We welcome the author of Serial Innovators, How Individuals Create and Deliver Breakthrough Innovations in Mature Firms. Bruce Vojak, welcome to the show.
Aidan, it's great to be here. Thanks so much.
Great to have you on the show, Bruce. It's been a long time coming. We've been planning this for 18 months. So
that's right.
Great to finally put the face to the emails and the voice to all the messages. But I thought we'd start with a few definitions, and feel free to expand on these definitions. One of the things I wanted to really share was, what is a serial innovator? The other was what innovation is in your view, because as we were discussing off air, that's the source of so many problems inside organizations in the first place. So let's start with innovation, then serial innovators, and then we'll build on why they matter.
Yeah, I'm so glad you decided to start with definitions. I always like to clear the table with that myself, so we're in alignment. A lot of people talk about innovation as being technology, and as you and I had just briefly discussed earlier, it's not necessarily technology. It could be, it could involve that. Same thing with creativity. A lot of people look at it as, oh, I'm creative, I do something different. And one of the examples I often show is a picture with a metal handle and a wooden head. And I say it's very creative, but it's not necessarily innovative. And so it kind of gives you a little bit of pause. And really, it's something it's new to the market, new to customer use, but something that has value that people will be willing to pay for. That there's financial implications and strategic implications really as well. And then I often personally take it one step further, and I talk about how, in the best cases, innovation redefines the basis of competition. And, I didn't ask for this, but I think if I could just show something that maybe you've seen before, but I don't know if you can see this well or not, a kitchen knife. And, 100 plus years ago, if you were peeling carrots, you'd use a kitchen knife. And if you're like me, you'd probably cut yourself and cut too deep or cut too shallow. But really, it was a problem that people, kind of lived with for a long time. And then at one point, someone said, well, we don't have to do this. And they came up with this idea of a safety peeler. And the blades are facing each other. And it has benefit not only of being safe, but it also has much more uniform peeling. And so it's a good outcome. And when people had this, early on at least, they had different design options. And so people experimented within that paradigm, if you will, for different kinds of ways of solving the problem. And then in the 1990s, there was a design innovator that came up with the idea of putting an ergonomic handle on it. And in fact, as an aside, the story goes that his wife had arthritis and she had a hard time peeling carrots, and he'd cut off a broom handle, put it on one of these safety peelers, and she could peel carrots. Now, we might ask, why didn't he peel them for her? But, that's a separate discussion. But the fact is that, he created a whole new business with this renewal of competition. And then, the obvious conclusion is that if you really want to renew competition, you make pre-peeled baby carrots. And, in that progression, you've maybe seen this and maybe some of your audience has, but to me, it illustrates how when you change the basis of competition, you really kind of reset the goal, if you will, of what people are looking for. It gives at least the person who innovates or the company that innovates that disproportionate, at least initial advantage to work with.
I heard you talk about this. I did my research. I heard you talk about this example before, and it made so much sense to me. But also, people would say, okay, well, if I do that, others are going to copy me or emulate me soon, okay? But
right.
To your point, you actually create a new market. You enlarge the market. I thought about Joe Pine, the idea of the experience economy and the value change between a coffee bean and a Starbucks, and buying the expensive coffee in a Starbucks versus selling the coffee bean, and how the end product actually changes. I also thought about Tesla and how Tesla opened up their chargers to everybody else, because if everybody's winning, the market's bigger. And those were just a few little insights maybe you might want to riff on.
Oh, well, actually, this is way old technology now, but VHS versus beta format. Beta was at least technically the preferred result. If people remember what videotape recording is, I'm showing my age here a bit. But yeah, the VHS format was opened, and it opened up all sorts of new growth, and it ultimately won. The thing that I love to challenge people with is to just look at any product that you're looking at and try to look at, what's behind that? Who is thinking about this? Why are they making these changes? And so this is one I haven't necessarily shown anybody recently, but this is a beer can. Back in the day, you'd open it with one of these openers. And then, how did the competition change? You've got the pop top, and now the pop top is environmentally safe because you've got something that holds it on. Each one of these steps changed things. And not just for the sake of changing, because there were some, deeper understanding of what the need was.
I love that. And I remember those can openers. They were lethal. Do you remember the little spike on the top, and you had to and you'd cut your hands oftentimes? Man, they were absolutely lethal. The other person who's lethal, I know when I read out that intro, so many of our audience were nodding and going, is he talking about me? Because that is the listenership to the show, Serial Innovators, and maybe not every element of what you describe in the book and the study, but certainly a lot of the characteristics. And as I say many times, I truly believe there's a place on the spectrum for a serial innovator. We belong there, because they don't often fit, and they are hard to manage. And actually, it's one of the things you call out. Serial innovators work differently from typical development employees, and therefore they need to be managed differently. So maybe we'll use that as a segue to describe what the serial innovator is, and then we'll build on this. And I was actually thinking, Bruce, in the book, you even advise how HR team can hire an interview for these people. How can you attract them to your organization? And I was like, God, that could be another episode on its own.
Yeah. And in fact, just to take that branch briefly, sometimes the best way to hire these people is to use the innovators themselves. And it's a bit like having a sommelier or someone, looking at counterfeit bills. There's I hate to say that there's an art to it, because sometimes people get dismissive of that response. But that being dismissive of that view really precludes a whole line of thinking that's so valuable in all of this. But you're right. How do you identify and develop these people?
It's interesting you said that about the sommelier idea. I was thinking, and they have a special light that they shine on a dollar bill to see if it's fake or whatever.
Yeah.
But that is a huge problem. I talked about this before. The second innovator problem, when you have a head of innovation who goes into a company, claims they know what they're doing, and actually, I have to say, sometimes they don't. Sometimes they don't know what they're doing, and they think they are good for the role. They don't know it's a political role in a lot of cases. They don't know how to navigate politics. I've experienced that myself. That is it's soul destroying, the amount of politics and politique you have to speak. But when that happens, the organization is once bitten, and the next innovator comes in, and they're dealing with the history of the previous innovation lead, and that's a huge challenge.
Well, one of the things we've been talking about this is how do you identify, and I know we can dig deeper on this, but even going to like, what do we define these people as? And today I might change the definition a bit from what we had in the book. The part that I'd keep is that these are people who have had significant impact on their company. They're people who have a significant financial impact and strategic impact on their company, that they've done it more than once, that they've been involved at some level, at least from start to finish. And they've really, done this from within the organization. They're not necessarily, let's say a VP of innovation, an executive level, but they're the people that really saw what was the opportunity. They saw potential for something. They had a hunch, they pursued it, and were able to bring people along. And so in the book, one of the things we suggest is that people like Steve Jobs and Paul McCartney would be serial innovators. And again, I'm thinking, oh my gosh, this is like, over 12 years ago, or actually almost 15 years ago now. And what would I change? When I talk about it now, I really restrict my definition to people in mature companies and mostly in mature industries, because that's where, and this is going back to where you were taking us a moment ago, that's where you've got companies where they very often lost the recipe of how to, if you will, and I don't mean recipe in a literal sense, but they've lost that ability to know how to innovate. They become so focused on optimizing within maturity that they get a bit skittish about trying to do something different. And so that definition to me, especially in the context of a large mature company, but even in a mid-sized mature company, really plays pretty well still today.
I was thinking about that, Bruce, because you work still as an advisor and a board director for mature companies mainly. And I actually genuinely think sometimes they don't know how they discover their first product anyway, because luck plays a huge role in emergent strategy or finding a product in the first place. And you can stumble upon amazing products. I mean, everybody was a brilliant property millionaire until 2008 and 2009. A lot of us have scar tissue about that. But the same thing, you can just be in a buoyant market. You can stumble upon a product and it just takes off. Maybe you have some type of patent or some type of IP moat around the product and it can take off. And then later on, as you say, your S-curve wanes, you're at the top of your curve, and you never had that skill in the first place because you had early success. And I often think about that, the curse of early success.
It's that idea of, if you have the skill or the talent to do this, you will see it play out in multiple ways. There's an individual, and I'll just briefly mention her story. I think we might come back to her other times. But Nancy Dawes at Procter & Gamble, she has 3 stories that are just remarkable. The first one was with chocolate chip cookies, of all things. And then the next thing, it was with Pringles, and really propelling Pringles into the top tier of snack foods. And the third one, which actually is kind of 3A, B, and C almost, is the Olay product. And, I don't know what your experience is, but my grandmother used this pink, gooey beauty fluid, oil of Olay. And it, and in fact, it's just something that, you think of from maybe the 1960s, and P&G acquired that brand. And Nancy, as it was in decline, actually, and Nancy had responsibility from an innovation perspective to renew it. And by then she'd already seen and done these things a few times. And so her approach that played out to this was not only informed on that, but it was even reinforced that she had a level of confidence that developed that, yeah, I can do this. I see things that other people don't see. And that's why this idea of the repeated nature, this serial aspect of the innovator, to us, and when we did the study, was so important.
Because you mentioned Nancy, let's give a flip side, because one of the really interesting things was Chuck House. So,
absolutely.
love Chuck. We had Chuck on the show. For those of you who don't know, I know regular listeners, you'll definitely have heard Chuck. We had him four times on the show. Much like this, Bruce. It was supposed to be one episode and it turned into four. But the thing that I found so demoralizing was, so he has the win with the screen. Remember the first product he did,
Yep.
and he followed all the rules of, if you want to call it, or the playbook of your book, The Serial Innovator. Followed the diagram of circling, etc., etc. We'll come to all that and describe it,
Please.
But one of the things he experienced was he had the win, then he went for another win, and it didn't work out, and he got punished for that. And I was telling you before, like, I don't know where I heard this. It might have been a Nietzsche quote or something, and they said, if you want to punish somebody, don't punish them for doing something wrong, punish them for doing something right, or something they believe is right. And I felt so much empathy for Chuck when he happened that. And I wondered, did you stumble upon that in your Serial Innovators?
I love the question. And I don't want to portray these people as being perfect, porcelain models, because they're very human, so I don't want to, inappropriately project that, but I'll quickly add, and I think you mentioned this with Chuck. Chuck even helped in areas outside of his work at HP with emphysema. And, that to me is a beautiful example, because it shows that the way I view it, innovators are discoverers. And Chuck is just a beautiful example of a discoverer. And we could unpack this for a while too, but, sometimes you place a bet and maybe it doesn't work, but you catch it early enough. And sometimes you place a bet that is pretty risky, as Chuck did with his Medal of Defiance. So, anyway, I don't mean to make this all about Chuck, but I think it was a wonderful interview that you had with him.
Thank you. Well, I actually learned so much from him as well. And it was great to see through his eyes what happened and the challenges he had, etc., and the lack of ego in lots of ways. Like, one of the things we talked about was giving away the credit. I'm sure if you're in P&G, one of the things you're wondering about, I'm sure, is like going, do I get a cut of this $1 billion product I've just invented? One of the examples you give as well in P&G was Tom Osborne. I thought this was a great one to share.
Tom's story. Tom's passed away a few years ago now. Tom, and in addition to interviewing Tom, I had the good fortune as an opportunity to speak with him at a conference once. And, I kind of told the pattern across industries and companies, and then Tom shared his story. Tom, and, if you don't mind, I'm going to spend a little bit of time to develop this, because I think it's worth it as a kind of a pattern for others. Tom's background was as a physical chemist. He had a PhD in physical chemistry. After his PhD, he did a postdoc with Harold Urey, Nobel Prize winner. So, Tom's scientific credentials, just impeccable. And he ended up going from, if you will, academia into industry with P&G, and worked within analytic chemistry for a while. So the kinds of things you'd expect from a PhD physical chemist. And he then transitioned into the feminine hygiene product area. And at the time, and this is, when you look at these projects in context, in hindsight especially, they make so much sense. At the time, feminine hygiene products within P&G, that area was heavily populated by people who came over from the diaper business. And so their paradigm, if you will, of what the product looks like was that it was like a diaper. It was there to catch fluid. And Tom worked in this, and he was given an assignment to improve that product, and he worked on that. But what he began to sense, and this is the beautiful thing about a lot of these people, they began to get this sensation. And again, I don't want to make it sound too mysterious or anything, but he began to get the sense of disconnect. Like, I am not sure this is necessarily the right solution. And I'm not sure if this is the best way to solve this problem of managing menstruation as in the form of a product. And he continued working on this, but he began to realize that there might be something more. And so what Tom did And this is a pattern we saw across so many innovators. He dug very deeply into what was going on. And so very often there's kind of this entrepreneurial perspective of we've got to let go of our hangups. We're just too tense. We've got to let go. And in contrast, what we saw with Tom and what we saw with all these other innovators was that they dug deep to understand what the unarticulated assumptions were. And so Tom started studying menstruation. What is it? And how does it, if you will, differ from, and again, urination? And as we wrote in the book, Ray and I learned more about these products than we ever really wanted to know. And, I don't mean to be inappropriate, but it's fascinating from an innovation perspective, because here you've got blood and urine, very different types of fluids. One's more viscous, one's more liquid, if you will. The nature of the flow, the timing of the flow is just very different. And yet you're taking one model that works well for one situation and trying to apply it for the other. And it worked. I mean, that's the thing. It's a lot like saying, I've got a safety peeler. It worked. And the safety peelers, 70 years probably of legs on that product. But eventually somebody said, hey, there's something different. Well, it's the same thing with Tom on this. And so he studied the biological processes. He worked with the medical models. And I wasn't aware of this, but when physicians are trained, they work with humans to train to understand things about anatomy beyond just the models, the physical model. They actually work with people to more deeply understand. And the more he dug into this, the more he was, I'll say, convinced, or at least more confident that yes, there's something different here. And that was what, let's say, the challenges began for him, because he began to view it not as a diaper to catch a fluid, but as a garment. And the minute that design concept changes, the minute you redefine the problem, that's the innovation. And then the question is, well, okay, are there technologies there that can actually do this? Can I bring the organization along? And one of the things that was typical of many, but not all, the people we interviewed is that Tom twice almost lost his job. And, and that needs to be shared, because he was considered to be disruptive, not aligned with the company business. And, and I get it. I mean, I got to say, they had just launched the Always brand, feminine hygiene product. This was after the toxic shock syndrome problem that P&G had with tampons. As I recall, I think I got the order right. I'm not sure how close they were in time, but they had launched this product. It was really addressing, the Always product was a very successful product in the marketplace. And so what Tom was doing was actually challenging that. And it's like, we've got this good product, Tom, leave us alone, and they kind of, I don't want to say it was a mistake they made, but the mistake they almost made was they set him aside, and that gave him even more time to work on this. But again, he was persistent. He had a passion for his customers. One of the phrases that he used when we interviewed him was that, and this is a very appropriate statement, I never would want this to sound inappropriate about Tom, but he said that his products were like love letters to his customers. And, what a beautiful metaphor for, what an innovator is doing. They're motivated to solve these problems. And he persisted, and he would at times get a more senior executive involved, and they would advocate with him or for him a bit, and help him make the case. And then, he got a setback, and then again. So this is not a linear, have an idea, get a buy-in, launch it, and everybody, gets awards for that. It was very much a stew almost of activity and bootlegging things. And it was at a time when within the company you could bootleg products, because financially the accounting systems weren't as tight as they are today. And if you don't mind, at some point I've got a story related to that I think you might find interesting. So he was able to finally get this launched, and it was the Always Ultra brand, which was the next step in the product. billion-dollar brand for P&G. That's how they define their big winners, billion-dollar brand. And it was an innovation that almost didn't happen. And again, a marvelous guy. And, we saw this in the people we interviewed that they're just exceptional people in terms of their passion for customers, their deep insight. And I'll say that not to disparage academic insight, but not in a detached academic sense, but very much, I just want to deeply understand this. And then now I'm going to bounce back. You talk about how you identify these people. Well, these are the kinds of things you look for. How deeply have they looked into things? Do they look under the hood, or do they accept surface answer? And I don't know, marvelous person, and I'll then extend it to say marvelous people. That we've had, we've been just so fortunate in this project to meet these people. So maybe I hope this wasn't too much, Aidan, but
A joy. Beautiful, man.
well, and to me, it's a beautiful story. And I don't know how else to say it. These are stories I want out there. And that's why I really mean this. I'm so glad to be on this podcast with you. I love to have these stories out there because I think they need to be heard, to encourage people, to challenge others, and to say that this is what innovation can be in a beautiful way.
Well, for me, man, every episode is a love letter to the audience.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. And
I don't know where I came up with that, but I just came up with it.
Yeah, but it's true though. And actually, I told you, I've listened to him over time, but again, more recently, and not only Chuck House, Ian McGilchrist, my gosh, I mean, I could just wallow in his sessions with you. Yeah, there's some beautiful insights that are there.
Absolutely. But I'm going to come back to a few things. We want to come back to your CFO story, your finance story that you just teed us up for there a moment ago. But one of the things was, we had Jeff DeGraff on most recently.
Yes.
We did a 3-part with Jeff. And he was telling me about this guy in the army. So this guy had created processes to get stuff done, innovation done better. And his process was co-opted for the COVID vaccine. So huge win. And he was celebrated briefly. The champagne was put away quite quickly. And then he got passed over for promotion. And I do want that to be known, because that's where I was going with, Nancy was celebrated and she was then put on other products, and she was celebrated, she was known to be, but it doesn't always work that way. Sometimes you go against the grain, you'd uncover something, and then you're punished for doing the right thing. And I always think about, there was a famous story of one of the coaches in NFL, and he punished one of his players who did a play at the end to win the Super Bowl, but it wasn't what the coach told him to do. And he actually marked the guy down, even though they won the Super Bowl, because he broke the rule. And for me, that's actually the lesson that happens. And not always, just like the whistleblower in any company, it doesn't always end well. Same for the innovator, it doesn't always end up well. And I think it's important to call that out, that not every organization is mature enough to go, okay, they deserve a medal of defiance.
Aidan, absolutely. And as I just briefly stated earlier, we selected on the positive stories. So when we went out looking for people to interview, we framed, this is our definition of a serial innovator. Do you have people like this? And I'll quickly add that one person told us, yeah, we'd have people like this. I didn't know anybody else did. But that's that's a rabbit trail. But to say that what we didn't do, and this would be a whole other study, although I think it'd be a can of worms, would be to interview the people who had these experiences you're describing and became kind of bitter and cynical and checked out, if you will. And I mean this as no disrespect to the people I'm going to allude to. Obviously, I wouldn't mention names. I've known people like this, and I understand how they can feel that way, and it's sad. I don't want to say that the serial innovators are more resilient, because I think that's a bit of an easy answer for me to give. I think there may be some truth to that. You'd refer to a lot of this being luck. I think that can be part of it too. It's being in the right situation. But I think so. The question is, you don't want to have either error. You don't want to have things go to market that are just stupid ideas, and you don't want things stopped that are wonderful ideas. And those two types of errors how do you walk that line is a big challenge. And I think how we even navigate that today is different than it even was a few decades ago.
But you said there, like situational goes beyond the organization. So I've seen people like this, and I know sometimes it's like, man, I just had a baby. Man, I have a massive mortgage. I done this before. My wife can't tolerate me doing it again. Like there's those situations, and they have to make really tough calls, knowing that in a way they're giving up and they're putting their brain in the desk, putting it away and just checking in and just getting a paycheck. The great D. Hawk, who was a great mentor to me, who wrote the foreword to my book, he's the founder of Visa. He told me he had a term for it. He called it retiring on the job.
Yes.
And he said that moment, he had that moment. And I think a lot of people have these moments where I had it, where I gave up on a company I was working in as head of innovation. And I remember one day coming in, looking at myself in the mirror and saying, I'm well paid. I have a pensionable job. It's not any effort here. It's easy. But do I want to be here checking in every day? And I'd look around the building and the company, and people looked older than they should look. And I actually think it's a little bit like Dorian Gray.
Yeah.
You're checking out, you're dying on the inside a little bit. You might have great hobbies, but you certainly hate going to your job every day.
And I've seen that too. And I think everybody, all of your viewership, I think, will have seen that.
That's a horrible thing. And also, I mean, you're like, we were talking about you haven't retired. You don't intend to. Also retirement. I mean, you see people decline massively when they retire. So anyway, whole different episode.
But I'm going to quickly add one thing, and I don't want to lose this. It's not that everybody who isn't a serial innovator is, should be on Prozac and has given up on life. I mean, and I'm exaggerating to make the point because, there are these other, and we'll get into this, I think maybe still today, there are these other roles that are a perfect fit for other, if you will, personalities and perspectives. I'm going to use a quote that my colleague Ray Price, one of the co-authors, his wife was a piano teacher. And she said, I can teach anybody to play piano, but I can't have all my students play at Carnegie Hall. And so not everybody's going to be a serial innovator, I 1 in 500 in some companies, and smaller companies, maybe it's 1 in 100, but you get the idea. It's not that everybody's doing this, and it's not to diminish the other people, because there's such important other complementary roles, whether it's executives or whether they're colleagues in other areas. It's just the ones that we're saying, as you had pointed out, that are checking out where maybe that was something that wasn't the right choice for them. So I want to be clear. I don't want to say that we live in a society of people who are checked out, but is everybody fulfilling their potential in the role that they're in? Maybe that's a better way for me to think about it today.
Yeah, well said, man. Really well said. I'm glad you said that. But I think we need one more definition, which is the idea of you said companies forget maybe their origin story or how they did it the first time, and they're stuck in the second iteration of how do I jump the curve, or how do I do this again? How do I regenerate innovation or a culture of innovating within the organization? And you say in the book, firms need to support 2 types of innovation to stay competitive in business. They need incremental innovation, exploit, and breakthrough or radical innovation, explore. So let's share those 2, because they set us up then. And I want to get our audience ready. If you're listening to this on a podcast, you're like a podcast platform, audio only, you're probably better off for this episode from now on anyway, moving to video, because we're going to go through a series of diagrams that we've had designed especially for this episode, and Bruce is going to kindly bring us through them. And they bring us on the evolution of the stage gate process into how a serial innovator does things and has succeeded over these 50 different people that have been interviewed. So I'm just teeing you up for that. But let's start off first with this idea of incremental versus radical or breakthrough. Your definitions and anything else you want to add around that, Bruce.
Yeah, it's great. And in fact, I'm going to just briefly go back to this, the idea that we discussed earlier with the carrot peeler, because the carrot peeler is, to me, a real rich example of what incremental versus breakthrough might look like. I'd shown, actually, Aidan, you're mentioning to look at video. I've got two different types of safety peelers here, very different. And I mean, I can't with confidence say exactly why these two designs were done. This was actually purchased on eBay as a vintage vegetable peeler. I never knew that you could Google that. So go figure. But my guess is that this one uses more metal. It probably requires a manufacturing process that's more costly. And so to me, incremental innovation is this idea of how do we, as Thomas Kuhn would have said, how do we optimize within that paradigm? And it's important. I mean, it includes things like, adding a different flavor to a beverage or adding a different fragrance to a laundry detergent. And I'm kind of limiting us, if you will, at least initially to consumer products. But, you could envision that these are any kind of product where you're exploiting the existing platform of product to win. And it's not only different designs, it includes using a lean implementation, Six Sigma, and it's really working to optimize within that paradigm. And now I'll take a step back. You mentioned the S-curve, critical. And even in the second book, we even emphasize it more because, you start with the stew of activity, it emerges, there's a rapid growth, and you hit this plateau. And it's at that plateau where companies increasingly rely on incremental innovation because they're looking to extend that success. And what Breakthrough does is it renews this basis of competition. It's, to me, it's the definition that I love to keep going back to because it's like saying, okay, we're all playing football. I'm thinking American football, but I'll let you go any direction. But and then between seasons, we're going to change the rules, and it turns out that the rules are going to favor teams, with or without running backs, or with or without certain kinds of kickers, And suddenly, if your team has a player like that, you're either propelled up or propelled down. And what you're kind of looking, and it's not always that explicit, but you're looking for these opportunities. And so to me, that's the difference between what I would say is a breakthrough versus incremental. It's not one is good or bad. It's just that you need both and that you want to squeeze everything out of a product that you have. But you can't do that necessarily at the expense of a really great renewal opportunity. And, go back to Tom Osborne's story. They were squeezing profits out of the Always brand. And that was a relatively new product platform for them. So it was difficult to challenge that. I think of emotionally difficult for people who were invested in that to keep extending that. And so, there could be these tensions even, and I'll quickly add, and again, I alluded to Ian McGilchrist earlier. He talks about S-curves. And I'm stunned because when I listen to him, I think, oh my gosh, there are so many parallels with businesses when you think about left and right brain and exploration versus exploitation, if you will. And it's these concepts, they maybe don't repeat, but they rhyme across these different areas and these patterns are there. And I'd say that's the tension that you have. And one of the things that we found was that, you've got this optimization culture and you've got what I'll call innovator friendly culture. It doesn't have to be like a startup innovator, but at least friendly to them. And in the best situations, they're going to work in tension with each other. They're never going to be fully resolved. In fact, you mentioned the DeGraffs. I'd say a bit of what they talked about was a tension, this idea of conflicting or complementary views. And when they're in tension and they're managed in tension, it works. But it's just way too easy and it's deadly if you don't manage that tension. And you tend to let, again, going back, not to belabor the McGilchrist view, when you let the emissary rule and you don't let the master at least appear periodic. So, well, maybe I'm getting way over that.
I was the same. It's why I had Ian on the show because I have a tome of work there. The two books, The Matter with Things, but the left and right brain thing made absolute sense to me. And there were so many things where we went deeper, where he was actually talking about how it literally is the idea of exploiting an explorer with the left and right brain. And an example he gives, you probably remember, was the pigeon or a bird. We say a bird brain. Well, the bird's brain is so small that it's split into two, and actually the sight. So when you see a pigeon, if you ever see this, I see it everywhere now. Of course, once you're aware of it, the pigeon looks at you with one eye, but it'll look down with the other eye. So if it's looking for a piece of like grain amidst a load of grit on the ground, it will use a different it'll use a different eye because that eye is associated with one side of the brain, and then it'll look for the bigger picture with the other eye. And I was like, oh, well, that's just
Oh, I feel back and look for that because I had missed that.
Yeah.
See, those are beautiful stories because again, boy, again, I apologize because this is reminding me of different things. We can go back 500 years and we can talk about Albrecht Dürer, the printmaker. I'm going to tell you, he was an innovator. He innovated business models, And so we think about innovation as being something of the last, let's say 50 or 75 years. Innovation, when done well, has been around forever. And what we've done in the last 50 or 75 years is found certain patterns that repeat and documented those patterns. But it wasn't like open innovation occurred because it was studied. Open innovation existed. I'm just using that to illustrate. Blue ocean, it existed. These are and the reason why they took off was because they were patterns that existed. But what I'm saying is the thing with the birds is a beautiful story because these are things that are out there and we're just trying to say, oh, isn't that interesting? This is what it really looks like.
Yeah, I love making those parallels, and it's the beauty of doing the show is that, and being a little bit eclectic with the guests and going a little bit in neuroscience, a little bit of understanding different things. But I would have spent a year with Ian.
And I would have loved a bit of fly on the wall.
Oh man, it was great, really great. So, and I had him twice. I had him for the master exam the first time years ago, and then for we did a 3-part on his recent book as well. But I could have easily done a 3-year with him weekly. It was so much knowledge, but lovely man as well, by the way. So
I can imagine.
One of the things you said there was really important. The idea that, say, blue ocean or any type of framework that somebody puts a name on it, and then people go, oh, that's how you do it. That's how you innovate. But the famous stage gate process, I remember actually when I went to move from my first job, which was in digital transformation, I was going to go to a role in a company acquired by MasterCard called Orbiscom, and I was interviewed about the stage gate process. And I was like, I didn't know what it was. And even though it was in development, because I was using an iterative process. And when they said it, I was like going, but that makes no sense. It's because I was doing stuff like app development. And our process was get an ugly version out into the marketplace, see how people react to it. Because
an MVP.
Yeah. And the reason was because initially I learned the hard way where I'd put out a survey and go, if we had this in the app, what would you use? And like, yeah, then put it out there and nobody even touched it. We're like, going, that was a waste of time. So then we're like, well, let's just keep updating. And plus the audience go, wow, well, these guys really care. So when I saw a stage gate process, I was like, this makes no sense. Plus you're going to have to manage a board where the board are like, how's that product coming along? You're going, well, here we are midway through this stage, the stage gate process. So with that, I'm going to put on the screen, and I'm going to invite any of our audience who've been listening to us so far, switch over to YouTube. If you do, I never ask this, and I'm terrible at asking this. Please leave a like or a comment, because and smash that subscribe button. I've never ever said that, Bruce. But my kids keep saying to me, you never ask people to do that. And I'm like, I'm going to ask you now. So if you're with us now still, please do that. And subscribe to the show as well, because it helps our sponsor, Kyndryl, know you're with us as well. So I'm going to tee up now on the screen the stage gate process, and we're going to go through this and the evolution of these different diagrams. And Bruce is kindly going to take us through these. And Bruce, I'll be sharing little excerpts of these on LinkedIn as well. Little segments, little bites for people. So take us through this, and you tell me when you're ready for the next image.
Yeah, this first slide is what I think everybody would probably agree is a pretty generic stage gate or phase gate type project or process. The left side is the fuzzy front end. The right side we've identified as the gates and stages itself. The fuzzy front end is kind of that stew of, let's say, a shapeless stew of where does the insight come from? And then the idea is that once an insight is generated or an opportunity is recognized, that there's a next phase where somebody catches that idea and says, oh, I think we can do something with this. We can make it into a product, or there's a need that we've identified. And then you put it through a series of developmental steps where you make a small additional investment. Maybe you'll begin to assess the market for this idea. And if it still looks good, you'll continue. If it doesn't look good, maybe you'll put it on the shelf and set it aside for a while. And then the next phase is you build, as you suggested, you build maybe a more realistic prototype. You use that to test the market, and you iterate like that until you get to a launch. And and I really mean this, the beauty of a stage gate process or this model is that it does allow executive management to see where things are. And it's because they're often, and this is not meant to be disparaging, because they're often detached from the day-to-day activity. This is a simple way of communicating to people. I'd say processes too. In fact, I've used this in the second book more. The processes instruct the neophyte, the newbie, and they remind the experienced person about what to do. Because I've seen, experienced innovators like an amazing concept. And after probably about a year of development, they realized there wasn't enough niobium in the world to make this product a reality, And so those are things that could have been avoided if you had gone through the steps in an appropriate way. So, there's value to these things, but it is kind of a deconstruction of what really goes on and a reconstruction. And so, what we found was that, and I think maybe if you go to the next slide now, this slide, to me, just kind of sums it up. There are different roles that we observed when we conducted our research. And like anything, we tried to discern the patterns. We didn't want to necessarily impose these roles, but we felt pretty comfortable that these patterns were out there. That on the far left side in the fuzzy front end, you've got a role that we would refer to as an innovator, very often a technical person, engineer, maybe a scientist of some form in a technology-enabled company. And I will include, consumer products, Kimberly-Clark, Procter & Gamble. You've got technical people in those companies. You might not consider them the same as Intel or Google in terms of technology, but they're enabled by these technologies, clearly important. And then the idea of this hero inventor has an idea, and then the champion is someone who very often is very market focused, who gets the idea and says, oh, I think we can do something with that. Or maybe they tell the inventors, here's some need, and then it flows through. And if the idea is considered at least viable at that early stage, it goes to an implement. And these are three different profiles of people. Again, the one on the far left tends to be more technical. The one in the middle might be a technical person who's moved into marketing. And then the one on the far right, the implementer, is very often a project manager. And these are very different roles from each other. And if you go to the next slide, then what we observed with the serial innovators, they were people that played across all these roles. They didn't necessarily play at the same level across all these roles, but they did play across them. And so they had these insights, understood the market needs sufficiently. And while they weren't necessarily the one responsible for implementing, they very often, and we'll see this more as we get to the hourglass model in a later slide, but very often they saw it through. Not that they led the implementation, but they stayed tethered to it, because what you don't want is to have a great idea, let go of it, and then find out that it's been corrupted down the road somewhere, that somebody's, made some changes that make sense to get it out the door, but they maybe lose the value of the product concept itself. And that tethering plays an important role even in influencing and creating market acceptance at some point. Again, we can share a couple of stories later. And then the next slide, I just want to briefly go to, because the inventors tend to give what has been commonly called a technology push solution. The champions are going to give you what's historically viewed as a market pull solution. But there's times and situations where both are appropriate. I want to be really clear. So For example, technologists may have some idea to do something that the marketing people would never have even dreamed to ask for. And they'll, oh, it's interesting. We'll take that and run with it. The one that is more commonly understood would be the other way, where a marketing person might say, oh, my gosh, if you just add a peppermint version of this in addition to the fruit flavored version of it, it'll be great. And so then they send the technologists, if you will, back to the lab, and they come up with the right formulation that'll not only work in that physical product, but, persist with good shelf life and all the other good features. And so, we look at those two as different areas, but the serial innovators, they operate across both. It's not an either or, it's a both and. And we wrestled, Aidan, I have to tell you, we wrestled with what charts to even show over time because, again, these morphed over time, but they almost always started with understanding the customer need deeply. So they weren't always necessarily what we would call market driven. It was customer driven. And Tom Osborne's story, I think, is a great example. I jokingly said it's non-marketing, it's customer-ing, because it's really understanding the person who buys the product. And that's where Tom's investment of himself into the needs of the individual was so critical. And so as you see in this chart, you start with this customer need, and as they're looking at it, they're saying, well, I can do something with this. I think that there's some technical solution that might be viable within this customer need. And then they're like, but wait a minute, if I do this, will the customer still need it? And they go back and they tweak it a bit and they go back to the technology. And then all of a sudden it's, well, wait a minute, is the market big enough to even make this worth our time to invest ourselves in? Is there that level of viability? And they go out and they probe the market, and it may be with this idea of an MVP. It might even be with a prototype, or just a mock-up to say, if you had this, would you consider it? And then, and as you had mentioned earlier, to what extent do you believe that information relative to someone just paying money for a product, the ultimate goal? So it would go back and forth. And even this idea of going back and forth, it suggests a process, but I hate to say that it's not really a process. It's more of what I will call a state diagram, borrowing from the old computer literature, that you go to all these different points, but the order, how you do it, the simultaneity of it versus sequential nature of it, it's all kind of a side issue. It's just that you have to touch on all these things before something is a success. And I'm going to briefly step back too and say something that I was thinking about as I was preparing for our conversation, that, and I want to be sure I say this right, that our approach was to come at this multiple ways. We looked at who they are, we looked at how they innovated, we looked at how they're motivated, how they're managed, and even how we looked at these people changed over time. And I do not want to say that Ray and Abby and I are innovators, but it goes to this idea of how discovery occurs. And I'd say that we were at some level discoverers. We were discovering who these people are. And I'll say that's what the innovators do. They discover the market, they discover the customer, the personal need, even in a B2B situation. What are people, what is the buyer willing to pay for? They discover the market. Is the market big enough for us? Is it attractive enough over time? Is the technology there? And they immerse themselves in all these things. And they see them in what I will say is more of a simultaneous, and it's an overused word, but a holistic way. And I'm going to then briefly, since we're on this, I'm going to show a book. I don't know if you can see this. Magic Eyes. Are you familiar with these diagrams?
No.
It's a children's book, and they have these amazing images. I don't know if you've seen these. And if you look at them just right, you'll see an embedded 3D image.
Oh, I know them. Yeah, I know the post.
Yeah, posters, or again, I say children's books, but I've loved to use that metaphor for how these people work. And that doesn't mean that if you're able to view these, you're going to be a successful innovator, but everybody sees just a mass of dots or a mass of colors. And, oh, that's nice, pretty picture. The innovators, though, they have this posture of how to look at these. And they see it holistically. They've got this bifocal vision, and they see a pattern that other people just don't see. And again, I don't want to make this too mysterious, but I want to call out that this is what discovery looks like, whether it's innovation in the company or it's whether I'm learning how to use my gas grill in the backyard without burning the fish. I'm discovering a pattern.
It's
And
interesting you say that.
please,
Bringing it,
yeah, sorry.
no, but it's true. Like Ian, bringing it back to Ian, we talked about this, and
Yeah.
in one of the books, he has the picture of what looks like a load of dots. And
Yes.
when I look at it, I saw, well, straight away, it's a Dalmatian. And he's like, well, that's because you've honed your right brain a little bit. But a lot of people will look at it and go, well, what is that? And that was the point. And actually, I'm glad you stopped on this diagram, because I wanted to double click on that. The idea of the innovator, it's really important. It's a really important thing if you're a manager of an innovator. The motivation is not always financial. It's you can't help yourself. Like, it's like, I was thinking about how it's the exact same as stuff in life. Like, say, for example, something, I know a piece of information about you that you should know, and loads of people know about it, but they don't tell you. I have to tell you. It's like, I cannot hold myself back from telling you. If I think you should benefit from this, to know this, I need to tell you. And it's the same dynamic, the same mechanic, where,
Beautiful.
like, it's very different from having an insight and taking action on that insight. And it's like that thing of like, you have an idea. You're thinking, well, what are you going to do about your idea? It's like, I think I should write a book. I'm going to write a book. It's a very different thing where you actually take action on your insight. And I think it's more than just, it's to be able to see diverse. It's like you were saying about the Ian McGilchrist thing. I straight away thought about Ian when you said it. I knew exactly what you're talking about. And it's to see the same theory or the same mechanic or the same mechanism appear and be applicable in different fields. And it's a very, very different thing. But oftentimes what happens, and definitely happened to me, and I'm sure many of our audience happened, is you end up getting in trouble because you're kind of going, well, that's a marketing role. But what are you doing? What are you doing messing with marketing, Aidan? And you go, I'm trying, and you're like, I'm just trying to help. I actually know what this thing should be positioned as. And they go, no, that's marketing. You stick to your innovation stuff. And you kind of go, and you don't see it that way. And then you're like, I know the sales guys are struggling to sell this. Let me do a session with them and teach them what it means and how to articulate and what to say to the customer. And they're kind of going, no, you stick with sales. We'll stick to the sales. And you're kind of going, and that's why this diagram of going back and forward and scribbling all over the page totally makes sense to me, because to the serial innovator, it's a red thread. It's not a load of lines.
It's right. And it's funny that you even mentioned a lot of lines, because we used to talk about how the innovator spoke of connecting the dots. We very often heard things either explicitly or suggesting collecting and connecting the dots. And I would always think of those children books where there's a number, 1, 2, 3, and connecting the dots is very linear. And when I saw this metaphor, actually in a of all things, of a book about epistemology, that's a separate discussion. But I realized, no, it's a parallel processing of this. It's a very emergent view of the world. And you begin to, I think some people even can anticipate these patterns before others, and they see things, I hate to say that others don't see, but they anticipate a pattern before somebody else. And they see the pattern as it's more emergent, again, with whether it's, we call it right or left brain or whatever, they see these things, and then they are willing to place bets on them.
I'm going to show you something. I'll show this for our audience as well. So just so I give full attribution to this, this is a company called Gaping Void, and they share these beautiful images. So there's this one that it just reminded me of here. I'm going to show it on the screen.
Oh, yes.
You know this one?
I haven't seen the conspiracy theory, but I absolutely love that. This is a version I've not seen, so please, if you don't mind, if you email me that later, because
100%.
I've seen the others, and the others are so stepwise, and I love that. But I love the last one. And there's the movie A Beautiful Mind, and and so then the question is, what's the real pattern? What isn't? And yeah, I love this.
So I'll share that one. Well, let's get back on the track of
sorry,
of the next in our diagram. So we share this idea of how the convergence of generating customer and technology understanding, that idea of the MVP going back and forward. And actually, one more thing on this diagram, Bruce, I'd love you to share is the willingness to also kill your darling. So
Well,
you've birthed this thing, you've done a lot of work, and the willingness to actually do that. But the organization doesn't understand that and think you've wasted a fortune, and you're kind of going, no, I've saved us a fortune. It's glass half full versus glass half empty. I saved us a fortune because I proved it was wrong, or it was too early. Let's put it on the back burner and reemerge it when things are a bit better, or the technology's right.
well, again, I love where this conversation, all these different places we've gone with it, because one of the things that when I work, especially with mid-sized companies that are usually a bit more skittish about investing in innovation, not always, but often. I don't mean startups that have reached mid-size, I mean ones that have been around for a while. It's a tough sell, and as I think you had mentioned, perhaps even before we got onto this recording, that once you've failed in it, it's more difficult for the subsequent person to come in and succeed. And so when I've pitched innovation to those companies, I like to say that there are two important values of innovation that really can require a very small investment of someone like the person we're speaking of, not even full time, half time. And that is that and this is the obvious one, it's an option for future growth, which means that if we find something, it's going to be worthy of our time and investment. But it's also an insurance policy, because if you invest in this and you find out that there's something that competitors are thinking about or could be thinking about, and maybe you catch it before they do, you have at least an opportunity to invest in that. And, I'm not convinced that the manufacturers of safety peelers would have necessarily anticipated, an ergonomic peeler. But I think if they had brought a design expert, like my colleague Walter Herbst, who I co-authored the second book with, if you brought Walter and his son Scott in, I think they could have, not to sell, OXO, but I think they could have said, I think there's something here, and again, I have stories we can tell about that too. But yeah, I think it's an insurance policy. It's an option for future growth. These can be very small investments. And, what company doesn't insure their business from burning down or their executive from having a heart attack, and, but yet when you tell them this is an insurance policy, very often there's a bit of tensing that goes on. So,
100%. And, just full disclaimer, Bruce owns a company that sells carrot peelers.
no, it's funny. I almost always tell people that I don't make any money on these. So thank you for sharing that. Yes.
Okay.
But actually, I sell pre-killed carrots is what I know. Oh, I don't.
So let's jump on to the MP5 model. So we're going to MP5, and then we'll land the ship on chapter 1 with figure 1.7 as well. So jumping on to MP5 now, over to you, Bruce.
Yeah. MP5, and again, as I had alluded to maybe about 10 minutes ago, we came at this with multiple studies over time, multiple ways. As a quick aside, this project with Ray and Abby and I, it just emerged very fortuitously. We mentioned it in the book just briefly. I started looking at what I call technical visionaries. I started getting some data, and I shared it with Ray Price in a parking lot of all things one day. He said, what are you working on? Ray, look at this data. And Ray's like, I used to work on people, like this in companies. And Ray's got a background in organizational behavior. Me, a PhD in engineering, but then, engineering executive. We were told by people at National Science Foundation, by the way, about a mile away on campus, there's Abby Griffin. Who, if you don't know her, you ought to talk to her. She's working on product visionaries. And so the three of us came together and we did these multiple studies over about a dozen years. So we did not start out saying, we're going to write a book. We're going to, we've got this image. It just emerged with these different studies. And I'd say that one of the things that this P5 model does is it documents decisions we made about what these people look like, if we wanted to just describe them. Another way we've talked about them is how their activities play out. And I'll probably talk about that with you another time, but this is meant to be very descriptive. If you look at it, there's an inner set of circles, and then there's the outer two rings. And the inner set of circles are things that, for the most part, people bring with themselves, if you will, to the game. their perspectives on the world, and at some level, even how they're prepared to innovate. And these are things that I don't want to say they're hardwired, but I'd say that it's just the way these people, for the most part, are. And as a quick aside, I've been asked, is it nature or nurture? And again, I'll default to Ray Price's wife's comment. I could teach anybody to play piano, but they're not all going to play at Carnegie Hall. This whole separate discussion. I don't believe that everybody can truly be an innovator of the type we're describing. I just think it's not there. It's like saying everybody ought to be Pavarotti. It's just not going to happen. Their personality is, are they curious about things? We talked about left to right brain. Do they have some tolerance for ambiguity? Are they systems thinkers? Do they persist with problems? These are things that just kind of who you are as a person, whether you're going to be in a business situation or at home over a cup of coffee with, family members. The perspectives they bring, it's fascinating. They're kind of simultaneously idealistic and pragmatic. They're pragmatic because if they're technical people, they say that, technology is there to serve the business. They're not just, if you will, having fun tinkering in the lab, but they're idealistic in that they really want to do their best. Earlier, you had talked about, you've got this insight and you just have to share it with people, and it's like that. They're just like this. And then I'm going to just jump to the motivation side. They're internally motivated to solve customer problems. And that motivation they're just drenched with that motivation. I was in a meeting Friday with a group of primarily CEOs, but also senior executives and general managers of divisions. And they were talking about the challenges they had in, if you will, they didn't call it this explicitly, but motivating their employees. And how do we get someone to rise up and do this and that? And I'm sitting there thinking about the Serial Innovator work, and I'm thinking, you ought to hire them, not to disparage them, because they're amazing people. I'm thinking, well, you're trying to, with your energy and effort, get these people to act. The better approach would be to hire people that are self-motivated and then provide them the context to work within. And yet all these people got there because they are just so, in the best sense, driven and motivated. And then they have to let go of that to find other people who are driven and motivated in a different, very complementary way. Because these serial innovators, none of them are aspiring to be the CEO of the company. And that's why I draw the distinction with Steve Jobs, because these are different people. And then preparation, I've often talked about the serial innovators as being multiply deep and broad. They usually start with one technical domain, Tom Osborne, deep technical domain with chemistry, related analytic chemistry. But then, he goes into the workplace and he learns deeply about feminine hygiene products. And then he learns deeply about the market and customer needs. And then they're broad in that you ask these people about their hobbies and, oh my gosh, all over the map. And it's just because they go back to the personality, they're curious about things. So that's kind of what you bring to the table. And then the process and politics are the things that you see emerge more likely in the business setting, and they can be developed. If I were to do this chart today, I would probably make less of a distinction about what you bring and what you develop, because I think at some level, the process and politics are inherent in the people who are more naturally successful. But the politics, and I'm sure we'll discuss this at a later time, that's a choice that these people make at times, because they're not always inclined to navigate the organization. But if they want to serve the customer need, they know they have to do that. And so the politics is taking ownership of this idea. Again, your comment earlier about, I've got this insight, I just have to share it with you. I have to bring people along with this. As we'll discuss later, we used to refer to that as crossing the bridge, because it's, as another quick aside, I'm an engineer by personality. I don't know if you've heard, you can tell if an engineer is an extrovert because they're looking at your shoes, And so it's painful at times for me to sell myself. In fact, when you earlier said, I hate to ask for people to click, I thought, oh, I can relate to that, But it's the politics, is bringing people along in the organization, because you can't fulfill those customer needs unless you bring people along. And then the process, and this goes back to, I don't want to say shattering the phase gate or stage gate, because that's really not fair. It's a useful process to look at. but it's saying, it really doesn't describe what goes on. And we have to overlay something. Maybe this is disparaging, more nuanced than the stage gate, but the stage gate is great for incremental projects. It's great for technology push or market pull for the most part. But when you're looking at things that are breakthroughs, that are really redefining competition, it's not going to look like that. And this is just from observation. In fact, I'll quickly say none of this is meant to be prescriptive. It's all descriptive.
And we'll describe the hourglass model, which is the main core model in the book, on the next episode. But we'll finish chapter 1. I pulled a little excerpt and I just thought it was really worth saying. And I had loads, by the way. I shut up today. I stepped, please, because I had so many little nuggets I loved. You said here that unlike other highly creative individuals studied previously in great depth, these serial innovators operate in the context of an organization. Serial innovators tend to work at the middle level of their organizations, whereas the previous literature has focused on individuals creating independently outside an organizational context. That's a big thing. Serial innovators do not hold positions of power that would force acceptance of their project. That is huge. That point is huge. Consequently, they must develop the ability to interact successfully within their organizational environment. They must manage the politics of the organization to gain acceptance for the customer problem they want to solve. They know that they must sell their ideas to others, and they have to work the political issues upwards to management, laterally with others needed to do the job, externally with customers and other expertise who they need. They depend on influencing others to gain acceptance and resources. Generally, they focus on positive influencing actions rather than coercion or negative mechanisms. This political understanding enables these serial innovators to transfer interesting ideas and creative concepts into the implementation-focused commercialization process. That whole piece is exhausting to say for me.
I'm glad you read it. I would have wanted to read it, so thank you.
Exhausting for an innovator. Exhausting to have to do that. And I often think about it like a game of snakes and ladders, because not just the concept of you go up the ladder and then you meet a snake, but there are snakes in the organization who'll actually be out to stop you. Like you were saying, I'm not saying it didn't happen to Tom Osborne, but people who have their identity tied to the status quo of the existing product that you're attacking or undermining in their view versus improving and doing what's best for the organization. But in there's a huge, huge job that is the job, do I want to do this? Because it is a huge weight. It's a huge drain on energy. It's hard enough to do your job anyway without having to do this. I used to say this idea, Bruce, that it was like in a previous organization I worked in was very innovative and commercial, and I was able to touch my toes very easily. Then I went into this organization that was a public organization. Most people did not want to change. And it was like somebody put a massive fat suit on me and I couldn't touch my toes anymore. I was like, this used to be so easy. And that was draining. It was actually demoralizing, draining, damaging. You felt gaslit, ostracized. There's so much that you take on when you go for this. And I always just want to ensure somebody who is thinking of this role understands this part that you talk about as well.
Oh, several things come to mind. One is it's a bit like Sisyphus. You just keep pushing that boulder up a hill every day. The other is, and this probably would have come up naturally later, but it's so appropriate to say now. One of the people we interviewed said, I want to hire people, not that they want to be an innovator, but they want to do the work that innovators do. And think about that distinction. And so that paragraph or so that you read, that's the work that innovators do. And that's partly why and I don't think we had this in the book. I think this is something that kind of struck me later. These are the most important people you've never heard of. And not just for solving customer problems, but I often talk about how they solve customer problems. They address the needs of executives. They address the needs of their colleagues. They're helping people keep employed. They're addressing shareholder needs. I mean, they're really simultaneously solving, if you will, the whole equation in a potentially hostile, it may not be hostile, it may be just an indifferent environment. And yet they have the will and the drive and the skill that they develop or have to pursue it. And so, yeah, that's why The politics is huge.
I think it's always so important to say, because I know so many serial innovators and they feel they're the problem because the organization makes them feel they're the problem. But it's also, it's not commercially driven. It's in you. It's like you have to solve it. And there's that problem about like, well, I also have a family and a mortgage or whatever responsibilities you have. And you kind of go, I need to balance that. So that's why I say it's situational, that sometimes you might go, I'm not up for this fight. It's too big at the moment, maybe this period of my career. And I can understand all of that. But let's land the ship on the last diagram from this, because you do have another diagram that goes, well, this is more like what a Serial Innovators does, which is 7 from the book. And by the way, for anybody who's a Substack member, you can find my show notes on our Substack as well. And Bruce, for people, before we finish and go through this, where's the best place for people to find you?
I have a website. The consulting business that I operate is called Breakthrough Innovation Advisors. So if you just look for breakthrough-innovation-advisors.com, you'll find that. But, LinkedIn, Aidan, I should have started with LinkedIn.
LinkedIn.
It's the go-to place.
And I'll link
that'll get you anywhere you need. So
I'll link to you and I'll put those links in as well. But I'd love you to take us through this innovation process used by Serial Innovators.
Yeah, this is in contrast to the stage gate, as we talked about earlier, and it starts in the upper left. And I often liken this to like the Bohr model of an atom. Where's the electron in this model? Well, it could be just about anywhere at any point in time. Usually these people come into the situation where, as I said, and I've maybe belabored this, but they're motivated to solve a customer problem. And they're very often assigned something to work on. But it may not be the right problem. And so they'll often, initially at least, try and understand what's the right problem to solve. And we look at, again, to use Tom Osborne's story as an overlay to this, his deep understanding, well, I'll come back to that. In the end, he didn't necessarily solve the problem he was assigned to solve. But we'll come back to this. So they look to try to find the right problem. And then once they have a problem that they're generally satisfied with, because actually a number of them said that it takes as much time to solve a good problem as a bad problem. So why not solve something that's important or address something? And then they really deeply understand it. And this goes to what I had mentioned earlier about how it's not just letting go of your hangups. It's that deep dive. It's collecting the dots, if you will, and in some way finding the meaning of a collected set of dots. What's the pattern? Not necessarily the dragon in your conspiracy theory that you showed a moment ago, but it's looking for the pattern that really, truly does exist. And then once you think you've understood it enough, then you begin to say, I think there's a concept, a product concept, and I should add too, the book's written heavily from a product perspective, but, innovation processes, business models. Again, we're talking discovery here. This could be overlaid on me, as I said earlier, learning how to use my gas grill. You try things, you invent things, and you validate, you come up with ideas and you test them. And to the extent that you find something good, you move down to the lower left. That's kind of the stage gate, the right side of that process that I spoke about earlier. It's developed iteratively. And then before market launch, there's an activity that these people get involved in often, of helping create market acceptance. An example that I might use is if you have a consumer product that involves something that's ingested, let's say a toothpaste, for example, you're going to be working with the FDA to be sure that not only the person who picks it up off the shelf is going to buy it, but the FDA is going to allow you to buy it. Or in Nancy's case, that you can't call Pringles a potato chip, it's a crisp, and she could tell the story better than I can, but you're working to create market acceptance by not just limiting yourself to that one area, and then you launch. And what makes this different, a couple things, but one of the big ways it's different from the stage gate is that you don't necessarily go through this in a linear way. And so you might get to let's say you get to the invent and validate stage, and it's just not working for you. And in a way, you could argue that Tom Osborne was given a problem. He understood the problem deeply. He was inventing and validating based on this diaper paradigm. And he's saying, I don't think this is the right problem. He goes back and tries to understand it more. I don't think it's the right problem. He goes back to innovating. I don't think this is the right problem. And, he didn't maybe say it quite that way. And he goes back to the upper left and he goes, this might be the problem. And then it's not as much finding a technology that solves the initial problem. It's identifying a problem that needs to be solved and addressed. And so, and you'll see this when we get to the hourglass model. I'll anticipate it, but we don't need to go there now. We shouldn't go there now. The point of all this is that these are all different states that you have to reside in at some level before a serial innovator succeeds. The upper half is typically consistent with the fuzzy front end. The lower half is typically consistent with the stage gate. Consistent. And again, it's very different. But again, I would challenge anybody who's learning to play a musical instrument to, again, learn to use that gas grill. And, I'm not bad at it, but I'm not where I need to be on some things, is to look at this. And I mentioned that in part because I did a workshop once with a group of people who were on a production line talking about innovation. And that's a whole separate discussion because I don't even think that's really, this idea box approach to life. But saying, look, you guys are doing this at home. You've got these hobbies. We talked earlier about hobbies. You've got these other interests. How do you discover what to do there? And I'm going to bring it back to, you mentioned about what a process looks like. A lot of companies will try to boil it down to plan, do, check, and act, the Deming view. And I'm going to be clear, I am a big fan of Deming. I'm a big fan of Lean and Six Sigma. So, none of this is meant to be negative. But have you ever asked yourself, where does that plan come from? It's like asking the question about the fuzzy front end. Where do those ideas come from? And that's really where my interests have been since. And I think this model is consistent with this very human, very personal act of discovery that I see innovation to be. And that's why I'm such a big fan of these people that we've met, because they just live it. They just do this as an activity. And I'm realizing the time, Aidan. I almost apologize.
Not at all. Not at all, man. You never have to do that with this show. It's an absolute joy. And I just want to tell our audience, we've only got through chapter 1. we covered a little bit of the intro, but chapter 1. And I'm very grateful for you, Bruce, for going through those diagrams with that depth. I think the richness, along with reading the book, I also, by the way, I have the Kindle version and the audiobook. And now the opportunity to go through this. And it's one of the things I want to say. You mentioned it, and I talk about this often, is that to connect dots, you first have to collect them. And it's one of the things that I think innovators do naturally. And as you say, just because you collect some music CDs or vinyl doesn't mean you're going to be playing in Carnegie Hall.
That's right, even better.
But at least you got to be. You firstly got to have some knowledge in the first place. And I really do see it as the reason why we do this work. For me, it changed my life when I had new dots and I had new lenses and I could see the world differently. It changed my world because my worldview changed. And I had lots of different ways of seeing the world. I could now articulate it in ways I never could before with confidence. And I think that that's what this work does. That's what this book does. It opens it up for other people. But you got to do the work. You can't bluff this. You can't bluff it.
Absolutely. I'm cheering you on here, Aidan, because I hear you. In fact, a lot of the way I view even discussing this today is informed on things that I've seen since we wrote the book.
Well, it's a joy having you, Bruce, and I look forward to part 2.
So, that's great.
So,
thank you.
Author of Serial Innovators, How Individuals Create and Deliver Breakthrough Innovations in Mature Firms, Part 1. Bruce Vojak, thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
Thanks again to our sponsor, Kyndryl, who runs and reimagines the technology systems that drive advantage for the world's leading businesses. With a unique blend of AI-powered consulting built on unmatched managed service capability, Kyndryl helps leaders harness the power of technology for smarter decisions, faster innovation, and a lasting competitive edge. You can find Kyndryl at kyndryl.com. And don't forget, check out the Kyndryl Institute. You can download the Kyndryl Institute app. There's brilliant articles by former guests on the show, future guests of the show, and a wide range of brilliant thinkers and people. You can find that at kyndryl.com/institute. See you next week.